co-sponsoring with the Undergraduate Business Council, which is a representative body for undergraduate students here at McCombs. And our topic today is big tech too big? Or that's the kind of catchy version of the title. Whenever a industry becomes essential to our lives, as the oil industry did in the 1900s, steel and aluminum, telecommunications in the earlier parts of the 20th century, and whenever within that industry, certain players, certain businesses are dominant, very big, have a large market share, questions start coming up about whether we should be afraid of them, whether they're too big, and what would be the standards for too bigness. We have laws, of course, on the books, the Sherman Antitrust Act and a whole body of antitrust law, under which many corporations, Standard Oil, Alcoa, et cetera, AT&T, have been Microsoft had findings against them, have been broken up, have been given other kind of orders. And there are questions you could ask about the morality or the justice of this, when it's right, when it's wrong, if it's right and wrong at all. As a moral philosopher, that's something I think about. But this panel, I think, is more not looking at the system of antitrust law from a third-party perspective on, do we want the system, how should it function, what's its moral quality, but from people who have been in it or working in it or thinking about, have had different roles, particular cases, and how are these judgments made, and what is likely to happen, and what do they think should happen in the case of the big tech companies today, which is something I think we all need to be thinking about, given that there's a lot of, something's going to happen in this field in law, almost certainly in the next decade or so. So let me introduce our panelists, and I'll be interested to hear and I'm sure what they all have to say on this issue. We're going to have discussion among the panel, and then later on, there will be questions with the audience. So first, Herb Hovenkamp, who is a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School and a DOJ Sherman Award recipient. Joshua White, who's a professor at the George Mason Antonin Scalia Law School and a former FTC commissioner. And Abraham Winkelgreen, who is a professor here at UT at the law school and is editor-in-chief of the Law and Economics Review. And as moderator of the panel, also let me introduce Jamie Susskind, who is the vice president of policy at the Consumer Technology Association. And with that, let me turn it over to Jamie to take it away with the panel.
Thank you so much, and we appreciate the chance to have this conversation tonight, and thanks to the panelists for joining me. We'll have to say that Professor Wright was my professor at the school you see behind him there at George Mason, so it's fun to get to share our panel screen on Zoom, not live, with him. So thanks all for tuning in. So let's start by talking a little bit about the so-called tech flash phenomenon, which in my company is a thing that we talk about a lot. So it seems like every day we're hearing complaints about big tech from policymakers on both sides of the aisle, as well as political pundits, commentators. And to me, it kind of feels like this wasn't really a thing you heard too much about before the 2016 election. So I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on, why is this happening? Why is this discourse kind of ramped up? And with a new administration and a new Congress, do we think that things might quiet down or kind of stay the same? And whomever wants to jump in, please feel free.
Well, I'll just toss a couple of things out. In part, the opposition to the big platforms. So we're talking Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google principally. Microsoft, not so much, because I guess it's getting a pass because it already went through the ringer once 20 years ago. But I think the big techs are getting opposition from both sides of the aisle, but not necessarily for the same reason. Democrats are concerned about bigness. I think more Republicans are concerned about what they perceive as ideological bias, because the big techs, for the most part, are heavily Democrat. But the techs, nevertheless, are in the unfortunate position that they are getting squeezed from both sides. The Google and Facebook complaints were both brought in a Republican administration. I don't anticipate the Biden administration is going to voluntarily dismiss either one of them. In fact, if anything, they are more likely to expand them. So for whatever reason, I think the big tech companies are in some trouble right now.
Abe, do you want to go next or you want me to jump in?
Go ahead, Josh.
All right. Nice to see you, Jamie, and it's a pleasure to be on with Herb and Abe. So I think, let me sort of start where Herb left off in terms of, I think the political wins on the right for this. I think, Jamie, you are right to say there wasn't a lot of this pre-16. But Josh Hawley was in Missouri suing Google, prior to that, or sort of ramping up to do so. And I think a lot of the seeds of what we're seeing on the right, a movement on the left to be concerned with bigness, and the tech firms are really big, so why not them? I think that's all new, maybe new in the level of invigoration, but not necessarily new for sort of democratic political priorities. The part on the right, like Herb says, is concerns over ideological bias, and so the sort of ratcheting in from both sides is a little bit new as a political matter. I think in terms of where it goes with the new administration, is really a mixed bag and hard to predict. But let me throw out a couple of things that I think are interesting. One is those lawsuits are going to have to get resolved. We're going to go in front of Article 3 judges, and the DOJ, run presumably by that time by a Biden appointee, and the FTC, sort of run by Biden appointees, are going to go and litigate those cases, and they're going to go in front of may not be till the end of 2023 in the Google case, but they're going to get in front of an Article 3 judge, and they're going to have it out and fight. There's going to be proposed legislation to deal with some of the perceived issues around big tech and antitrust generally, both coming out of the House, which issued its very sort of tech specific report with proposed legislation. And they propose in that report to do everything. I mean, it is overturning almost every Supreme Court case since 1977. They at some point proposed to overturn a law review article written by Frank Easterbrook. I don't know exactly what it means to overturn a law review article. I'm mostly jealous that I've not written one important enough that anybody wanted to overturn it. I'm still trying. But you've got a big sort of broad, ambitious agenda on the Hill too. I think both of those things point to I don't know if I'll say a quieting, but I think have a sort of muting effect on the debate. We're going to go to court, and instead of these things being hashed out politically and on Donald Trump's Twitter account, people are going to sue each other, and there's going to be some winners and losers. I don't think that there's anything that reduces the passion in a debate like a fight over legislative details. And so, both of those things I think cut in one direction. The politics right now are cutting in the other direction, right? So people are more excited about that. You've got both sides sort of invigorated and having hearings. And so I think you'll have, antitrust on the ground kind of running as normal. We'll go to court, and people will put on defenses, and those cases will make their way through the process. We should mention too, there's state attorney general's cases sort of floating, including one with Texas, floating around in the background too. So I think you've got this sort of interesting tension where probably the heat will get turned up politically, while you've got a natural sort of drawn out process in the courts that tends to be a little bit of a slog. And which one of those kind of wins out for the direction of this thing, I think remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I think that, in some sense, the fact that there are these cases may delay the push for legislative solutions, right? So, to the extent that these cases will take a while, if it turns out that the government isn't successful in a number of these cases, I think that would potentially amp up the desire for legislative solutions to make those who sort of feel like they already know the answer here, that it's because of a failure of the antitrust laws and thus they need to be changed. But my guess is that that push will be delayed a little bit until we get more information as to what's actually going to happen in the courts over this. And that as a result, although it'll continue to be a hot issue, my guess would be that actual passing of legislation might be harder, and while these cases are currently pending.
Great. So I do want to return to the lawsuits in a minute, but perhaps a bit of level setting. So Professor Hovenkamp mentioned, the names of some of these big companies that we hear about a lot that seem to be under fire lately. And I guess, from a competition perspective, since that's what you all are experts in, I mean, is big inherently bad? We don't hear a lot about, right? Like my association has 2,000 member companies, but yet we only hear about, maybe 4. Is big inherently something bad? And does big necessarily rise to the level of, an antitrust conversation? And whomever wants to chime in first, please just go off mute and feel free.
Well, big is not inherently bad. And when you start looking at these cases, I think the fact is there are relatively few monopolies scattered among them. Google search is very likely one. Google search has roughly 90% of search traffic right now. Why it has that, whether it's simply superior or whether it's because it's the default search engine on both Android phones and iPhones, that's a question that may have to be resolved. The App Store may have substantial market power. The Facebook complaint alleges that Facebook has roughly 60% of a market that strikes me as quite gerrymandered for personal social network services, which is kind of a cobbling together of basically all of the things that Facebook does, messaging, videos, photographs, news services, and so on. That one is going to get taken apart a whole lot. So, there's a lot of stuff. And as a result, by the way, I don't think we're going to see very much in the way of structural relief, that is breakups. The left has been clamoring hard for breakups, although breaking up platforms is hard. I think 2 likely candidates are really divestitures of acquired firms. It is undoing of mergers, and those are WhatsApp and Instagram, which were acquisitions that were actually approved by the government about 8 years ago. They have not been fully integrated into Facebook. They still have separate websites and separate customer lists. And I think there is some chance that they will be divested. But I don't think we'll have any breakup remedies beyond that.
So I think that's right. I mean the Google case, the way it's, and I'll return to the biggest bad bit in a second. The Google case, just for those listening, I mean the allegations are about competition to be the default search engine on your iPhone or your Android device. That case, if the government wins, it's not built for structural relief. The allegation is there's some bad conduct. There'll be a fight over whether the conduct was bad or good from a competition perspective. But even if the government wins, the idea is they'll get an injunction to stop the conduct. But that thing's not built for structural relief. The Facebook one will be interesting for the reasons that Herb says about whether they can get a divestiture on a deal consummated 8 years ago. The government's best cases involving consummated deals end up being where the acquiring firm makes the acquisition and buries the acquired firm's product, right? It's sort of easy to tell your competition story. the government has a different story, a different sort of story to tell here, and it's it's one, we'll see what the evidence is. It's one they could possibly tell. I'm a little bit skeptical, uh, in large part because the story is not about buying something and burying it, but the acquired products both were pretty successful. People listening have heard of WhatsApp and Instagram. They probably use them. In large numbers. And that doesn't mean that the government can't sort of make out a case that they would have done better without the acquisition. But it's a harder road to hoe. In terms of the sheer size issue, the sort of big is bad, the sort of antitrust black letter, sort of mantra is, of course, big isn't bad on its own. It's whether or not you abuse the monopoly power. I think a really interesting issue here to kind of tie your first question and this one together is if you look at a lot of the proposed legislation, both, Senator Klobuchar has a bill on the Senate side. There's a bunch of stuff coming on the House side. There are quite a few invitations in those pieces of proposed legislation to do exactly sort of a return to big is bad, right? Sort of triggering antitrust liability or presumptive liability on the volume of the firm, the sort of dollar volume of commerce, the size, the share, and to lighten what courts do in terms of analysis of effects. That I think is, for me at least, one of the places on, the big policy fights here is, we're on a particular place on the, I don't know if spectrum is the right analogy, but we're in a particular place in the spectrum versus sort of how much work firm size does on its own versus economic analysis of the effects of conduct. And most of the proposed legislation would sort of shift us towards size mattering more, and now there being a little bit less analysis and a little bit more work done by presumptions. And that's an interesting feature of the battle, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, under current antitrust law, right, big is not necessarily bad. I think that a lot of the media coverage of these cases and these companies, a lot of the way the politicians talk about them suggests that, in a lot of these cases, a lot of things raised aren't what we would normally think of as antitrust issues, right? So, there may be various, negative externalities associated with things that large tech companies can do, but a lot of them are not antitrust issues, right? So, people complain about, Facebook spreading disinformation, right? Or absorbing too much of people's time. These are not something that the antitrust laws are, were built to deal with, and they're not thing that, at least as they're currently constituted, that that the antitrust laws focus on at this point, right? So, in their current antitrust jurisprudence, as both Josh and her pointed out, right, big is not bad unless it is paired with conduct that tends to lead to higher prices, reduced quality, lower innovation, things that will reduce consumer welfare in some way or another. And typical antitrust analysis is that it's a necessary condition to have something called monopoly power for courts to look at the conduct of single firms and to see if they engage in, if they cause these sorts of effects. But it's not a sufficient condition. Under at least current law, there has to be some evidence that there is some negative effect on consumers through lower prices or through higher prices or lower quality or reduced reduced choice or reduced innovation. And so big in some sense is a necessary condition there, but it's certainly not sufficient.
So the argument, or one argument that's been going on lately, is about sort of the ongoing efficacy of the consumer welfare standard. And I guess I won't say there's people coming at this from a more political place, but they kind of want to, at least in my opinion, impose sort of a political analysis onto antitrust. And I wondered if you all have reactions. Do you think the consumer welfare standard is still what we should be looking at in the context of potential antitrust violations, or are there other options out there? I know FTC Commissioner Wilson talked about the total welfare standard, and there's kind of a whole range out there, and I'm curious about thoughts on that. And I don't want to put people on the spot. I mean, maybe Professor Wright, since you were at the FTC, I'll start with you.
I'm happy to start. Look, I think the debate over the consumer welfare standard, I mean, us sort of inside the antitrust circle, there's been debates over whether people are doing the some economic welfare standard correctly. Is it consumer? Is it total, et cetera? I think the debate that's being had now is between sort of outside the antitrust world and inside, right? It's the debate is over whether there should be an economic welfare standard at all, or whether the consumer welfare standard is sort of doing an okay job carrying out the functions we expect antitrust law to do, that is sort of protect competition and consumers. By my own lights, I think most of the proposals from sort of outside the antitrust institutions, the former FTC chairman Bill Kovacic referred to these proposals as sort of transformational, and I like that, so I'm going to steal it. But ideas to transform the antitrust enterprise into something either about political values or firm size or something other than, or multiple things other than consumer welfare. For my own lights, I think the consumer welfare standards performed pretty well. I think if you look at the evidence on the performance of the American economy, moreover, if you look at what happens when the antitrust agencies and private plaintiffs go to court when they get good cases, there's sort of two complaints laid at the feet of the consumer welfare standard. One is, goodness, it makes it really hard for plaintiffs to win. And the second is, it restricts analysis to economic welfare, and we really should think about antitrust as a bigger, broader sort of social tool. With respect to the first, I have a hard time seeing the case for that in the data. The FTC and the DOJ win about 85% of their merger cases for the last 30 years. You go to the consumer welfare standard requires the plaintiff to have evidence of competitive harm. If you have that, you're going to win. If you don't have it, you're going to lose. The government doesn't win all of its cases. Whether that's a crisis that creates a need for legislative reform or not, sort of in the eye of the beholder. So to count me on the no side of that line. There are certainly things in antitrust institutions that could make them perform better. There's no shortage of ideas. But in terms of the overall sort of structure of the analysis, is looking at consumer welfare the right thing? Antitrust current approaches, if you'd like to advance other social values, some of them are really important. Economic inequality, or saving particular industries or small business or what have you. We do those through other pieces of legislation, right? We do those through other bodies of law. I think that's worked well for antitrust. I think it doesn't work well when we don't do that, both historically and in other jurisdictions who sort of have a broader antitrust mandate. So my own view on this, and I'm glad that this is a debate in antitrust. I think it's caused a lot of introspection and sort of self-reflection inside antitrust institutions, and I think that's an important thing. But where I sort of conclude is, I think the consumer welfare standard as a overarching objective for antitrust institutions remains the best possible alternative.
I agree with pretty much all of that. Let me just add a couple of things. Both the left side and the right side today are exhibiting signs of a populist movement that rejects the consumer welfare standard. On the left is a concern about bigness that we've talked about already, that really does not belong in antitrust. A concern about wealth distribution, which is very, very important, but it's not really an antitrust issue. On the right, there's a concern about ideological bias. And indeed, if you look at the House Judiciary Committee set of letters that we mentioned earlier, a fair number of the letters on the right mix up things about political bias or left-leaning tendencies on the part of the big platforms as if they were antitrust problems, and they're really not. If the consumer welfare standard is properly applied, I think it works pretty well. I mean, I think the best definition of the consumer welfare standard is to encourage markets to have the highest sustainable output that they can manage, with output measured by quantity, quality, innovation. And there, I think the Supreme Court has been falling short. Too many recent cases, not just the Supreme Court, but the circuits, Qualcomm in the Ninth Circuit, approving a mechanism that clearly yielded higher prices in an upstream market for tech chips. Amex, which approved a system that caused higher prices every single transaction to which it was applied. The dissenting position in activists, which would have approved a pay for delay settlement that led to much, much higher drug prices. Those decisions, or the dissent in activists, are really very difficult to square with the consumer welfare standard. So, I think we have some work to do within antitrust on honing in on exactly what this consumer welfare standard means, and what's the best evidence of conduct that either follows or violates that standard.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get a lot of disagreement here on this issue from this panel. So, I also think the consumer welfare standard, by and large, makes sense. I think there are potential problems that that we might have that go outside the realm of consumer welfare for big tech companies, but I don't think that those are problems that should be dealt with through antitrust. I mean, any large company, I think it's perfectly reasonable in my mind to be concerned about, say, political influence of large, powerful companies. But antitrust is not the right vehicle to deal with that, right? I think, as Herb pointed out, obviously income distribution is an important issue, but I think that's there's lots of better ways to deal with equaling our income distribution through changing the tax system, changing the transfer system that will broadly target everybody rather than certain people who happen to work for certain companies or tend to buy certain products. And so there's the important thing I think that often gets left out is that antitrust is not the only vehicle that the government has to regulate our economy. And antitrust is not built to perform all manner of regulations, and we have lots of other instruments we can use to handle social problems, and we should use those to handle those directly rather than to try and do them through antitrust.
So is there something, which I think I could guess the answer, but is there something about tech that requires us to look at potential antitrust violations or, potential anti-competitive conduct somehow differently for the tech sector? So, Professor Wicklegren, I know you've written or spoken a little bit about sort of predatory pricing and like on Amazon, and which I thought was an interesting example. And I wondered if you could share more. I mean, I just wondered are we somehow needing to conceptualize this differently, right? I mean, as was pointed out earlier, the courts dealt with Microsoft many, many years ago, and I don't know that anybody considered that sort of a different or unique circumstance. So I kind of question, do we look at things differently here? And if so, why?
So I don't think we need to look at things differently from a broad standard, right? So I mean, there are things that are different, in a matter of degree in terms of the tech sector. So, the tech sector might be more prone to having dominant firms because there are network effects. It's not the only industry where there are network effects, but network effects can create some barriers to entry, right? There may be learning by doing that gives established firms some advantage, and that may be more prevalent in the tech sector. But once we look at those, there's nothing in particular about those, the fact that those effects occur in the tech sector, that make that analysis any different, right? And while my general view is that the courts don't take predatory pricing seriously enough, that doesn't mean that there's anything in particular about its occurrence in the tech sector that's any different, right? In the Amazon context, the nuance that is somewhat, I wouldn't say it's unique to that case, but it's somewhat different than the garden variety predatory pricing case, because we're talking about predatory pricing by a firm that's sort of both a platform and a seller. Now, that's not that different from what potentially could happen in a grocery store context, right? Grocery stores are platforms. They sell other people's brands, and they also sell their own brands. One difference is that Amazon may have a lot more market power than both than your typical grocery store when they're making those sorts of decisions. But again, that's something that antitrust takes into account all the time, right? So there's nothing in particular about it being a tech firm that warrants any different treatment here than you would have normal.
I think when all is said and done with respect to the currently filed antitrust complaints, if the government gets litigated relief, I think the thing that may surprise a lot of people is how absolutely conventional they are. Most of the things they are challenging are exclusive contract provisions, that type of thing. They're going to be addressed under the law we've got with respect to exclusive dealing, quasi-exclusive dealing, most favored nation clauses. We have differences of opinion on the extent of coverage of those laws. In fact, we have differences of opinion right among this panel, but there's not going to be any sweeping breakup. There might be a divestiture of an old merger. I don't think there's going to be an order that separates or spins off individual internally developed divisions or anything like that. When it's all done, most of the relief is going to be injunctions. If there is relief, it's going to be injunctions, and most of them are going to end up looking fairly ordinary.
I think that's right. So there's plenty of agreement there. I think they're fairly ordinary cases that sort of quasi-exclusive dealing for distribution. There's those types of cases across all sorts of industries all of the time. There's nothing sort of platform specific about the Google complaint. It reads like a payment for that Coca-Cola makes to buy a bunch of shelf space at the supermarket, and it'll be analyzed along the same lines, and there's a body of line that deals with these cases. And if the government wins, they get an injunction that says they can't give Apple $8 billion for preferred placement on the iPhone. What happens from that, I don't know. But that's sort of standard fair stuff and not very broad sweeping. I think, to go back to a comment Herb started with, and I think is important, one thing that might change now is the federal agencies might not be done, right? These cases took shape under the Trump administration. A 3-2 vote on the Facebook case. The Trump administration filed the DOJ case. You've got pending investigations at both agencies over, insert name of big firm here, basically everybody else. There's nothing that says the feds couldn't expand those suits, or the states can't fill voids that they feel like where the feds have refused to expand. So we still may see broader sweeping sorts of claims in those cases. But I don't think, we certainly don't have them yet. And I think most of what we're seeing, even assuming government victories in the existing cases, which, I'd be happy to bet Herb and Abe a beer on. I think what we'll get in terms of relief are not going to be the sorts of court, this ain't AT&T. It's not Standard Oil. We'll have a court order that says thou shalt not pay for default search engine space, or maybe at most, like Herb said, a divestiture of an acquired firm. I think on the politics of this, what's going to be interesting is if the cases go the way I think, and the government goes 0 for 2 in those cases, the political bodies on both sides are not going to be happy. If the cases go the opposite of the way I think, and the government wins both, and they get the remedies that Herb and I have described, both sides are not going to be happy. I think the sole consistency here is going to be that both political sides are not going to be happy, sort of either which way.
So do the other panelists agree with the 0 and 2 prediction, or do you have different predictions that you're willing to share, of course?
I think there's a good chance that there will be some injunctions that come out of these cases. If you look at the various contract terms involving advertisers, for example, I think there is a possibility some of those will be found illegal, but I think it's at least as likely that somewhere along the way the parties will settle those claims, because if they do litigate them and lose, then they're going to have to face a barrage of private follow-on lawsuits that they might be able to avoid with an early settlement. It's a little bit too early to say exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think the safest prediction is that there will be some sort of settlement at some point before we get a judicial decision. It's only if there is strong political pressure, I would say, on the government agencies to not settle and to try and get some sort of strong relief, which again I tend to agree is unlikely. That I think we won't see some sort of settlement along the way. I'll also add just that I think there's a reason why these cases have years of investigation and whatnot, and they uncover information that those of us sitting on this panel don't have. So I don't know that we can necessarily make really accurate predictions about what the outcome will be or should be without access to all of the detailed information that that the parties are going to release to the government.
Just apropos of one thing Abe just said, there's at least some evidence that both of these complaints were rushed a little bit. I think President Trump really wanted these complaints in his administration. And they're fairly cautious complaints. I mean, I think that's the way I would describe them. Fairly cautious in terms of all of the potential stuff that could be out there. And of course, both agencies are free to get at least one amendment and maybe more. So I think we might see them expanded, although I'm not necessarily predicting that.
I think this means I'm not. I think this means I'm not getting my beer. I think that's what happened.
I guess settlement doesn't count. So I will say that with the Facebook case, not so much the Google case. I'm kind of hung up on market definition, and I know other folks in this space are as well. Sort of just social media. I think that's very interesting because I don't see, even kind of like the big 4 companies, I don't see those products as interchangeable. So, I mean, how are we thinking about the market? As I said, I think the Google one is a little clearer, but like, how are we thinking about this as we move forward? I mean,
I don't think Google's I don't think Google is a whole lot better, Jamie, but they both have hysterical problems with respect to market definition because they're so differentiated. The markets are so differentiated, and The Facebook market definition cobbles together a lot of non-competing services. I think in these particular cases, the government needs to de-emphasize market definition and go for other means of measuring power. And we've got the tools to do that. They're generally more accurate, and they're particularly more accurate with respect to the platforms, because all of the transactions are of record. Everything is a digital transaction. And today we've got tools to measure market power directly that I think could be much more meaningful here. Now, there's been some reluctance to apply those tools in monopolization cases. We use them all the time in merger cases. And if there were going to be an interesting set of new econometric developments, I would think that they might come in the question of how you measure Facebook and Google's market power.
So I want to say we have 2 questions in the Q&A, but I believe we're supposed to have a separate audience Q&A period a bit later. So I'm just going to hold those for a few more minutes and then we will get to them. I did want to ask all of you and try to get your input. Do you think that we need a separate regulator, a separate digital regulator? There have been a lot of proposals on that. I know I have my own opinion, but curious what you all think about that. Why don't we start? I see Professor Hobekamp is off mute, so I'll start with him.
No. You mean a separate agency? No, I don't think we.
Correct. Yes.
I don't think we need a separate agency. I think if we did anything, we would give the Federal Trade Commission a little bit more rule-making power in this area. I'm not sure we need that either. One thing you have to always be careful about here, in tradition, a couple of things about regulation historically. Number one, it's been miserable for innovation. That is, regulation tends to entrench existing firms. It tends to entrench methods of doing business. It makes it more difficult to be nimble in business. And you want to avoid that problem with regulation. The other thing is the platforms are very, very different from each other. Historically, when we regulate, we would pick an industry like trucking or railroads or electricity. And in general, with some differentiation, the firms in that regulated industry shared a common technology. They were pretty much all doing the same thing. These platforms are radically different from each other. So I think the most you can get out of regulation is some telecommunications and broadband regulation, and also maybe some regulation of how the platforms gather, store, process, and share information. That I think is an area where we could profit from a little bit of regulation. But this is not going to be a market for command and control style price and output regulation like we've come to associate with the regulated industries.
So I agree. I certainly we've already got 2 agencies that fight with each other over who's going to do what. We had, both agencies tear up informal agreements with who's gonna investigate whom in these spaces. Throwing in another one, sort of count me out for all of the reasons that Herb said, and probably a couple more. The story is expertise and specialization in something. Trucking, that for the reasons Herb says, across a really heterogeneous set of business models and technologies, I don't think there's a very good case for it. But changing around the powers of the agencies, et cetera, fine. But I don't think that there's a strong case for a new regulator. I think the more interesting sort of twist on, and I don't think we're going to get one. I think the more interesting twist on that question is there have been calls in a couple of corners to do something akin to a specialized court for those types of claims. I don't have strong views on that either. I sort of made the case that I think courts are sort of, Herb and I can pick some cases to fight about where we disagree. You know, we have opposite views of Qualcomm. You know, we probably agree about activists. You know, there are cases where the government wins. McWane, I was a dissenter. There was very good evidence that output went up, and the agency won the case. You know, courts get it wrong sometimes in both directions, but I think generalist judges get a pretty bad rap in terms of the overall system in antitrust. And I think most of the time, complaints about individual cases are used to fuel flames for putting more, you know, making the agencies look more like regulators and less like law enforcement agencies. And that makes me a little bit nervous. Specialized court sort of lies somewhere in the middle there, and I think is an interesting idea, and one, you know, some sort of tribunal for those sorts of claims where you might actually develop expertise is interesting. I don't know if I like it, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I guess you know, broadly, do we need a separate regulator for tech? I don't think so for all the reasons that have been mentioned. I will say that you know, the idea of having a specialized court, not for tech but for antitrust, I think has some appeal to me. Right? I think there are a lot of, you know, very different issues involved in antitrust, and generalist judges who, you know, see an antitrust case, you know, once every you know, 2 or 3 years may not be best equipped to handle that. But certainly I don't see a reason why we would need a special court for tech or for tech antitrust, but a specialized court, you know, for handling antitrust is something that I would be quite sympathetic to.
Is there any merit to the proposal that FTC kind of leave this space and DOJ handle everything? I know resources is obviously an issue, but sort of based on, I don't know, expertise and capability, is that viable?
That's such an in-house decision. Josh probably knows a lot more about that.
I know there's a proposal, Senator Lee.
But
yeah,
I would be reluctant externally to provide that kind of instruction to the agencies. They, with some exceptions, including a fairly well publicized one about 2 years ago with respect to Qualcomm, but with some exceptions, they've managed to manage the allocation problem pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, this ebbs and flows, right? The conflict and cooperation between the agencies on this stuff. I think, you know, the Qualcomm fight was maybe the most high profile, but I think if you were to ask a bunch of DC practitioners how clearance is going at the agencies, you know, and you injected them with truth serum, the answer is pretty bad right now, or worse than it has been in any event, you know, and that's, you know, that's unfortunate, and it's a tax on the economy, not on, you know, the agency, when the agencies fight with each other or drag out the merger review process, fighting with each other rather than reviewing the merger, which is sort of getting more and more common. You know, the agencies sort of wait out the initial review period and then give you a second request because they spent the whole first 30 days fighting with each other. That sort of thing, you know, I think right now there's a little more tension between the agencies. I'm very hopeful that one of the sort of positive things that can come out of the Biden administration running both agencies is we could, you know, fix some of that. I think it sort of behooves all parties for that to happen. You know, I have mixed views. I've seen, you know, Senator Lee has a One Agency Act, and there have been other proposals around to take one of the agencies. People usually say the FTC because the DOJ has got criminal enforcement, to take one of the agencies sort of out of the party. You know, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's likely. You know, been around for a long time, and it's pretty hard to get rid of an agency. And so I don't think those are going anywhere. I sure do hope that real attention, though, will be paid to facilitating coordination between the agencies and maybe ironing out some of the most obvious differences, in merger review and some other places.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any particular reason to think that, we necessarily need to have, two agencies versus one, but I don't know that there's any, I don't know that the downsides are that large. I certainly wouldn't expect to think that, people who are advocating major reform of antitrust will be disappointed if they think that concentrating the power in either the DOJ or the FTC is likely to have, much difference. From a practical standpoint, they approach things, relatively similarly. There are, the DOJ may be swing a little bit more with the political winds of the administration, but ultimately, they both take the same approach to antitrust. So while there could be small efficiency gains from having one agency and eliminating these clearance fights, I don't think the general tenor of antitrust enforcement is not going to be any different if we were to do something like that.
Great. Guess this might be one final question. When we start thinking about structural changes to the antitrust laws, either to address big tech issues or kind of in general, Senator Klobuchar has said for her, this isn't just about tech, it's about other industries also. How do we make sure the reforms don't make things worse for consumers or small businesses or the economy writ large? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a real problem. Just look at the history of the Robinson-Patman Act. It was passed during the Depression to go after, at that time, the perceived evil of chain stores as they were rising. And the result was we got an unholy mess of a statute that did a whole lot of damage for about 50 years. And now it's very largely fallen into disuse. The government almost never enforces it anymore. My perspective on the Klobuchar bill is that everything that's in it is covered by the literal language of the existing antitrust laws, which are very, very broad. The Clayton Act reaches all of the practices that it reaches where the effect may be substantially to lessen competition or create a monopoly. Section 1 of the Sherman Act reaches contracts and restraint of trade, which means primarily output reducing restraints. Monopolization has pretty much an undefined meaning. It's really years of narrowing enforcement rather than the literal language of the statutes. And so what the bill is doing is it's inducing judges to interpret the antitrust laws more broadly. And with a couple of exceptions, I think it does so consistent with the consumer welfare principle. One exception is it authorizes pursuit of very large mergers simply on the matter of size. At least that's the way I currently read it. I think my own thinking about that one is I'm still thinking about it, whether we really need something of that nature, because that really is contrary to the general history of the way we've pursued firm size. Yeah, I think more is going to happen as a result of the legislative history. And we've had this history once before, and I'll shut up. 1950, we amended the Clayton Act. Technically, the amendments were not all that big. We extended the Section 7 to reach vertical mergers. We extended it to reach asset acquisitions. We fixed a split infinitive. But the language didn't do all that much more than old Section 7 did. It was the legislative history, which the Supreme Court got a hold of in the 1960s, and then radically rewrote merger law. But if you look at there's a major disconnect between, say, the Brown Shoe and Columbia Steel cases, one from before the amendments and one from after, and the language, which really was not all that revolutionary.
Yeah, I guess what I would say here, Jamie, is I think I agree with what Herb said about the one aspect of the Klobuchar bill, but I would sort of stir up a little disagreement with it. I don't think it's equivocal at all whether it's consistent with the consumer welfare standard. It's almost definitely not, right? It says we determine by firm size that a merger is likely to harm competition, and we just firm size alone. That's just not what we do with the consumer welfare standard, and there's not any evidence to suggest it's that firm size is a great predictor. The bill also does that on the conduct side, right? And so on the conduct side, it says firm size now is a sufficient condition for presumptive liability for Section 2 cases. That's, I think, a really big deal, and in my view, not consistent with the consumer welfare standard. It's those I think are objectionable. I think on sort of traditional consumer welfare grounds, but also I think, let me make sort of two observations about things I think are in that bill that I think are important for this debate over where we're going. One is, much to Senator Klobuchar's credit, I think she is absolutely crystal clear that this isn't just about tech for her. The House report sort of dresses it up as a tech-specific thing, but all of the legislation would apply to supermarkets and Walmart and Caterpillar and Procter and Gamble, but they dress it up as a tech thing. Sort of strikes me as unsatisfying for the debate. I think Senator Klobuchar, much to her credit, says, we're going to change the rules for everything. We're going to change the antitrust rules, and we can have a debate over whether or not those changes are good for the entire economy. And I think that's the way that the debate should happen, and we can all sort of share our views. The politics of that, I think, are also interesting. If you were the general counsel of Walmart or Procter and Gamble or Caterpillar, or insert your favorite brick and mortar company here, especially if you were a large firm, you've been watching these developments saying, goodness, I hope they stay focused on Google and Apple and so forth and so on. I think where the rubber hits the road is where now it's one thing to talk about, break them up as a bumper sticker slogan, but people are writing bills now. And when we see the language in the bills and those companies start seeing, hey, wait a minute, all my transactions are presumptively unlawful if I have a share above X. And then they go and they look at the way that the agencies are trying to define markets in the cases like we've talked about. I think the politics change. I'm not going to bet anybody a beer on the way the politics go, because I'm way out of my depth there. But I think that's really when this fight happens, is when the rest of the economy says, wait a minute, you're talking to me too. It's not just Facebook. It's all of your mergers are presumptively unlawful, unless the regulator says, okay. That's a major change. And I think that's going to influence the direction we go quite a bit. So if this is a 12-round fight on the legislation, I think we're in round 1 or 2.
Yeah, to me, I think one of the best features of the way the antitrust laws are currently written is they give a great deal of flexibility to the agencies to enforce them and to the courts. I think antitrust cases to me are very individual. It's very hard to make a broad statement about, to describe, I guess what I would say, to describe precisely in advance, right, the types of cases for which consumers are worse off, right, versus the types for which they're better off, even for relatively uniform conduct, right? And so as a result, I think any attempt by policymakers to remove that flexibility is potentially damaging in either direction, frankly, right? I mean, I think you could get, it's easy to see how you could get over deterrence. You also potentially could get under deterrence, right? If you have a situation where you create the impression, well, it's only when you're really big and these look like they're small firms, but they might actually still be dominant in some particular small market, or creating actions that are potentially anti-competitive. So I think anything that kind of suggests overly general rules is likely to be problematic and to potentially generate more false positives and more false negatives.
So thanks all. I am going to turn the conversation over to Greg, and he's going to take up some of these audience Q&As. So thanks all. I appreciate your time tonight. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I've been listening in. Very interesting conversation, and thanks for your moderation. Jamie, we have, I think, 3 questions in the queue. If anyone else who's in the audience wants to add questions, use the Q&A module below. I might also add a question or 2 in of my own. Let's begin with one. Because of a technical glitch earlier, it turns out that almost all of our participants, according to Zoom, are the same person, but they're not actually. So I'll only read off the name of the questioner when it's not a doppelganger of the one account. This is a doppelganger, I believe, of Aniket. But he asks, why do the panelists believe that these big tech cases are unlike Standard Oil or AT&T? So what do you see as the salient differences?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, because the fact is there are more differences than similarities among big monopolization cases over U.S. history. Generally, I mean, they're certainly different in their facts and so on. Standard was way too enthusiastic about breaking firms up at a time when there was very little history of breaking firms up. And of course, it was hit with the fact that within 2 years after the breakup, the price of gasoline went way up. And then they had to explain how that could possibly have happened. So, we're a lot more cautious today after years of bad breakups. Grinnell, United Shoe Machinery, Standard Oil. We're a lot more cautious today about simply kind of wading in with a chainsaw and cutting firms up. We use that kind of relief a lot more cautiously, and I think caution is advised in these cases. These platforms have produced an extraordinary amount of economic growth, and breaking them. I mean, how do you break up Facebook? Right? You put the boys on one side and the girls on the other, or you tell Facebook they can't run videos anymore, or you tell Amazon they can't have ebooks but only conventional books. It's very hard to come up with a breakup. Oh, and then if you divest, I think Josh made this point earlier. If you force Google to divest Google search, that doesn't break up any monopoly. That just means that we've given that monopoly to a different owner. And if Google search is in fact a natural monopoly, it'll just continue right on being a natural monopoly under someone else's ownership. So we've become a whole lot more cautious about structural remedies, and as a result, we tend to use injunctive remedies more. That's probably the one big difference.
Does anyone else want to comment on difference between these cases? I have a follow-up question for Herb then on that. This is just an issue of making something more explicit. A question I was going to ask is, and maybe I'll ask it more generally again later, is how do you guys think of the justice of these laws and of the way they're enforced? Are they right? Would it be better if they were different generally? And in particular, when we're comparing to past cases, do we take the past cases as it's obvious they were right, or sometimes as precautionary tales? And Herb, you're taking the Standard case as a precautionary tale, in effect. So I want to just see if I'm understanding right the standards you're using there, that this was a mistake. And so it's a mistake concretely because economic value was destroyed, the price of gas went up quickly. And so this is the rationale, I take it, for the consumer welfare standard now being a standard, right? Is that how you understand it?
Yeah, well, the consumer welfare standard gives you something to point to. There's disagreements about how to interpret it, but at least when you articulate it, people who know about antitrust say, well, gosh, I never heard of that. What is it we're doing anyway? One of the problems, quite frankly, is we don't decide very many big Section 2 cases. They come along infrequently. They're very expensive. They're very cumbersome. We end up reinventing the wheel every time we do one of them. It's not like, death penalty cases where you can, you want to study race discrimination in the death penalty. You've suddenly got a database of 2,000 cases to look at, and you can draw statistical conclusions. You just can't do that with big Section 2 cases when you've only got one every several years.
Okay, thanks. If no one else wants to chime in on this, I'll go to the next audience question.
Let me add really quickly, just to sort of square the circle on the difference between the cases. This is a point we've made a couple of times, but one of the big differences in the cases is that these cases have not been brought on a basis that lends itself to big structural breakup relief. The Google case, certainly not. It's a narrow case. It's a case about one particular set of contracts. It's not something bigger than that. You could imagine, and maybe one of the states will bring a case like this, but you could imagine with Google a case that says, hey, the way that you offer your searches, the way you design your product, that when I search for, I'm in Northern Virginia, so when I search for a pizza joint in Arlington, you gave me a Google map, and that's bad. You can imagine a case that goes after the design of the product, where the remedy is tweaking the design of the product or who owns what. This Google case isn't that. And so I think one of the important differences is, judges decide the cases that are brought in front of them. And these cases aren't cases that go to sort of the core business model or existence of the companies. And it's one of the reasons why they're not going to end up looking like Standard Oil or AT&T. The broadest we go here is the possible divestiture of WhatsApp or Instagram, should the agency prevail on that claim, which would mean I owe Abe and Herb a beer.
Okay, let me move on to the next question then. Sam is concerned about a well-recognized, as he describes it, phenomenon in the tech funding space, where venture capital firms will not fund companies where FANG compete due to fear of reprisal from the FANG firms. Given that this seems like one of the most likely areas to come up with a superior alternative business, do y'all think, so I think my first time saying y'all, despite living in Texas now for the better part of a year, do y'all think, that's in a quote, that there's anything that can be done in terms of law enforcement to provide some degree of protection to these firms without sacrificing the productivity gains of the tech giants? So, I mean, first, do you guys agree that this is a recognized phenomena with VC? And if so, is there a solution here?
Can you explain the phenomenon a little more?
I mean, I'm just reading this guy's question, and Sam, if you want to come in on this, either ask it as another question or type something to me in the chat, and we can bring you on. But I take it the idea is that the Facebook, Amazon, Apple, I forget what the anything FANG, Netflix and Google, these companies, venture capital firms are reluctant to fund upstarts that might compete with them because they're afraid of reprisals from these major players. And therefore, this is an area in which innovation is throttled somehow. And is there some regulatory or law enforcement fix whereby we stop VC firms from being afraid to fund competitors, or we stop these companies from reprising against VC firms if they do fund competitors? Or would it be a mistake to try to exercise power in that way? That's
So, I mean, I've heard this, complaint before, though my understanding of it always was, and I don't know exactly what the evidence for it is, one way or another, but my understanding of it was more a traditional antitrust concern that that you wouldn't want to fund someone who was, say, competing with Apple, because then Apple might take actions which would make that upstart competitor not successful, rather than a reprisal against a VC firm. I wouldn't think that a threat of a reprisal against a VC firm would be particularly threatening, given one that, if it's a large company, presumably they're beyond, worrying about VC firms. And also, there's lots of different VC firms, right? So you could imagine VC firms that were, targeted just to deal with new firms and didn't need to worry about, dealing with large companies. So I think the concern, at least as I understood it, was more that these large companies would just squash any competitor, and so it wasn't going to be profitable. I don't think there's, if we're worried about that, that's a traditional antitrust concern, right? And if we see a particular, if you see that sort of conduct and we think it's anti-competitive, you can bring a case, and the extent you get, you can win that case and get substantial damages. Well, that's money so they can potentially go and repay the venture capital firm, right? So I don't know that this presents any different antitrust, issues than we normally deal with in say, a standard Section 2 case.
The phenomenon I've heard about is actually really to the contrary, and that is that for many startups, it's easier to get funding if they can show some likelihood that they're going to be acquired by one of the big platforms. Or, to say it a little bit differently, the prospect of being acquired, which almost always occurs at a premium price, and frequently at a very substantial premium price, the prospect of being acquired becomes an inducement to funding rather than a disincentive to funding. Understanding that most of the startups are not very perfect competitors. In fact, they're almost always differentiated. If you want to succeed as a startup, you don't just sit down and do exactly what Facebook is doing and go head to head with them. No, you have some kind of differentiation that makes you attractive. And indeed, that's precisely why Facebook acquired Instagram and WhatsApp, is because both of them were much better positioned for small device markets, for handheld markets, where Facebook was traditionally developed for desktops and laptops. So they wanted some differentiation. So I don't think there's any general phenomenon of venture capitalists being reluctant for fear of reprisal.
Yeah, I will say here only that, because I think Abe and Herb sort of nailed it, but I will say here that this is an area where I'm fairly familiar with the data. It is a well-recognized claim in the sense that it is a claim that is often made and has motivated some policy discussion. Pretty hard to find evidence of it in the data
It seems
in terms of whether it's actually happening.
It seems to me that we're having this discussion on a well-recognized counterexample to the claim. Anecdotes don't prove anything, but I mean, Zoom is about as good a case you're going to get of somebody going into direct competition with Microsoft, with Skype, and to some extent with Facebook, and with Messenger, and Google for that matter, with Hangouts, and they got apparently whatever funds they needed to become the dominant pandemic platform.
Yeah, but importantly, just apropos what I said a while ago, Zoom was very much a differentiated entrant. The reason it grabbed so much market share is because what it was doing was much more appealing to so many folks as opposed to what FaceTime and the other incumbent offerings were doing. And I think that is the future of new entry into the platform markets, is differentiated entry. And that, the next kid on the block is going to be somebody who is doing something that nobody else is doing.
So that's Clubhouse or some such. But I mean, I think there's an interesting question as to what the differentiation was with Zoom, but that's maybe getting too much into tech and away from what the questioner was asking. So let me move on to the next question. So yeah, this is a good change of pace from the other ones. Several of you mentioned the Qualcomm case, and the questioner is just asking, could you explain the case? Question,
Josh, you want to do it?
I'll let you go first.
Qualcomm is kind of a badly behaved participant in FRAND, which is basically a standard setting interoperability and cross-licensing scheme under which participants in a particular market license out their patents at fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. Qualcomm basically sold chips in ways that evaded those terms, paid, and as a result was able to charge significantly higher royalties for a great deal of them. I know the reason I suggested Josh might want to talk about it is because I know that people at Scalia, including you and Tim Muris, took opposite positions on some of this. But in what I thought was an exceptionally well-reasoned district court opinion, Judge Lucy Coe found these things to be not only breach of FRAND contracts, but also antitrust violations based on fairly conventional market power assessments and contractual analysis. The Justice Department then intervened a couple of times, one with respect to Qualcomm's ability to get injunctions, and then a little bit later on the merits of Judge Coe's decision. And then the Ninth Circuit issued its decision subsequent to that basically agreed with the Justice Department's position and reversed Justice Coe's position. I believe that the case represents a serious threat to the FRAND process. And I'm afraid it's going to have very heavy negative implications in the future for multi-firm collaborative networking in high-tech markets. Cell phones is one of them, but autonomous vehicles is another one, and then there are some lesser ones. But I believe this was a case where the judges were simply not doing their job.
I will only say here, because if Herb and I go 12 rounds on Qualcomm, we will not have any more time for any other questions. But this was a case the FTC brought 2-1 with a dissenting vote on the eve of President Trump's inauguration. That happens. People sort of rush cases out politically. The eye in the beholder on some of these opinions is important. The decision that Herb describes and applauds from Judge Coe in the Northern District of California, I thought was pretty bad on traditional antitrust grounds. We disagree on the facts. I thought in particular on the evidence presented by the FTC. I thought it was pretty weak stuff. The Ninth Circuit agreed. I thought the Ninth Circuit opinion against the FTC was, not as problematic as Herb thinks. They cite me a couple times, so maybe I just like it because of that. But I think this is one of the things that's important about modern antitrust debate. It happens on the facts. the FTC, ultimately, well, we'll see if the Supreme Court takes another duty to deal case. But I think what Herb describes as the stakes of the case are right, but we sort of disagree on whether the Ninth Circuit or the district court sort of got it right on the end of the day in the quality of the evidence that the agency put on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I know nearly as much about the details of the case as Josh or Herb. I did read the district court opinion, and I guess I share a little bit Josh's feeling that there at least it was a little light on economic analysis. I thought there was, it was a lot of focus on factual claims about sort of various requirements that Qualcomm was imposing on the original equipment manufacturers. Didn't really do enough, I thought, to explain why these would be bilaterally optimal relative to just charging a higher price, which I think is kind of the central economic question when you're dealing with this sort of exclusionary conduct. I certainly think there are arguments, and they may have been valid in that case, that could explain why they would be bilaterally optimal and still be competition reducing. But I think my own view is the opinion didn't do enough to get into that particular issue, which I think is kind of the critical one in all of these types of cases.
Okay. The next question, I think you guys have addressed already, but I just want to read it or read a version of it and see if anyone has anything more to say on it or thinks that it's not been handled. So the author Kelly writes that it seems like the big tech companies are protecting their size by not harming the consumer directly, but she's concerned that they are harming people via their lobbying efforts to protect their value. And I took it that what you guys were saying before is maybe so, but then that's not an antitrust issue. It's an issue about laws regarding lobbying, and there are other tools to deal with that if it's a problem. Is that the kind of sum of the answer on that, or is there anything anyone wants to add?
I wouldn't add anything to that. I think it's precisely right. I mean, there's a tendency on the part of both extremes to try to use antitrust to rule the entire world, and the statutes frankly invite that because they're so thin. They use so little text, but it's important for antitrust people to keep their eye on the ball. And yeah, lobbying is a problem. Special interest capture, rent seeking are all problems, but we've probably got better ways to deal with them than through the antitrust laws.
I wonder if that points to a difference of agreement on the panel, because we've had from Abraham the flexibility of antitrust law, both for regulators and for judges, pointed to as a benefit of the law. You wouldn't want two codified rules. Herb, you're talking about the flexibility of the text, letting people bring it into areas where it's not the right tool. Is there space between you on the issue of whether these statutes are specific enough, or is it just, where do you guys stand on that?
Every time we've tried to make them more specific, we've screwed them up, with a couple of exceptions, maybe. I mean, the statutes were really intended to authorize the courts to create their own law about competition. They're not very specific. In one way, they're extremely specific, and that is they all use economic terms. They speak in terms of restraint of trade, monopoly, lessen competition, or create a monopoly in the case of the Clayton Act. So that, they don't incorporate any particular theory of economics, perfect competition or monopolistic competition. They don't say anything about any of those things, but they are not a full-blown invitation to just jump out of the discipline of economics altogether and go after some other set of behaviors.
Yeah, sadly, I don't think we're going to have any disagreement on this either. So, I completely agree. I think that it's great that they're flexible in that they allow the enforcers and the courts to look at the widely varying economics that exist in these different cases. And I think that that has to be taken into account. And but yes, I don't think that means that they should be taking into account all manner of welfare concerns that we might have. There are other regulations that can handle that and can handle it more directly.
So I'm gathering that the consensus position is they have the flexibility needed to address a wide range of concerns in different ways that are specifically economic. And Herb, what you're worried about is people, both of you are, who might use them to address non-economic concerns that would get beyond the purpose of the statute.
I think that's a serious thing to be worried about, particularly when Congress gets a hold of the bill. I think one thing we can be pretty secure about, and that is that if a version of the Amy Klobuchar bill does get passed, it's going to look quite a bit different from the one that we all have copies of right now, because that's the way the process works. And frankly, it scares me a little bit because you never know who's going to get this or that little clause put in that will do something wholly unexpected and quite outrageous, but that can happen. Greg, you've gone mute.
Oh, sorry. We have two more questions, and the second of these seems like a good one to end on. So let's go through them both. I think we have just enough time for that. The first person asked, this is Christopher, why the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint is a good thing. Americans pay much more for cellular data, he says, than Europeans. Why do you think that is? And maybe if this might be an occasion to comment on European antitrust and tech regulatory law, if there's any lessons, positive or precautionary, to draw from it for how the American system should develop.
Well, personally, I don't think it was a good thing. I think the concentration numbers were sufficiently high to make it prima facie illegal. I think the judge simply winked at very weak efficiency evidence. It represents my personal view is when concentration numbers are that high, you need to have stunning evidence of efficiencies, and they were simply not present. So I would not have approved that merger.
I don't have a particularly strong view of the case of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think, well, it's a good thing we have economists around to test some of these after the fact and sort of learn about their effects.
So we've got a questioner on the premise that you guys approve this merger and you don't. So you're maybe the wrong people to be asking it, unless you dissent, Abraham.
No, I completely agree with Josh that I don't have enough information at this point to have an opinion one way or another.
So then our last question is, what would the panelists like to see in the future in regards to regulating or breaking big tech? And so that's a very general question, but it gives you a chance to sum up with where you'd like to see this go. And so let me just turn it over to all of you on that in whatever order you want to take it up.
If I were the ruler here, I would like to get the courts to focus more on interoperability remedies rather than either structural breakups or very limited injunctions. And I think the thing about interoperability remedies is that they can expand the range of network externalities, both direct ones and indirect ones, by actually making networks bigger. This is what we did with the telephone industry. We broke the telephone industry up in terms of assets, but we still have a unitary network. And now the difference is we've got literally thousands of firms that participate in that network. And I think that's fundamentally a better way to approach many of the things that the platforms do. Force broader sharing of information. So for example, I think a good remedy in the Facebook case is to spin off Instagram and WhatsApp, but then have mandatory sharing of information, which means you preserve the network externalities. You get the big data, the big customer base that you would get from a single firm. However, you would have multiple firms doing it. And we do that voluntarily when we don't have dominant firms. I'll give you one very good example, email. Email, we have total interoperability. My proprietary email account can talk to your Gmail account or your Yahoo account or whatever. They're totally interoperable. And that has been achieved very largely by voluntary collaborative agreement. We can do the same thing with things like search engines if we want, and I think that would solve many of the competitive problems that we're facing.
Other visions for the future?
So I'll say the following. The United States has developed a remarkably innovative economy. These firms live here. They don't live in Europe. They don't live in other places. That's not caused by the difference in antitrust laws. But we do have a very different sort of regulatory and law enforcement regime here. And it's one that requires regulators to prove up some sort of market failure before we get to the remedy stage. And so what's been interesting for me as an antitrust person observing the policy discussion around breaking up big tech is it's right there in the name. We're on the remedy before we've talked about liability. We're, what do we do to break them? What do we do, and it's one of these so busy talking about what to do with the remedy and what to do with the redesign of these innovative firms that we aren't, in my view, taking enough time to think about the liability part of it. And that's why in the United States, it's the role that courts and judicial review have played is the agencies do not give carte blanche to redesign the inner workings of firms, be it on interoperability or product design, or even in joining exclusive dealing contracts. They've got to go to court and prove it. And sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. But I think that is a feature of the United States antitrust system, not a bug. It's a very different system in Europe where there's not meaningful judicial review of what the regulators want to do in terms of imposing remedies. It's very different than China. It's very different than any of the other, most of the other antitrust regimes around the world. My own view is that is a feature rather than a bug, and we'll see what the liability determinations are in these cases. But to me, the important thing, to answer the question directly about what I want to see is case by case evaluation of the economic effects of the conduct. That's how we do antitrust here. And I think win, lose, or draw in these cases, keeping antitrust institutions focused on that question is an incredibly important battle, much more important than any of the individual outcomes of any of these individual cases, because I think that antitrust system here, the one I described, is, while not the cause, an important contributor to the success of our economy.
Yeah, I want to echo that. I think the main thing that I would like to see is, put it slightly differently, is more humility from everyone on the outside that, look, we don't really know without really detailed analysis whether this conduct that people are concerned about is anti-competitive or pro-competitive. These are hard determinations, and people can disagree. You know, Josh and I might disagree on some of this conduct if we looked at it and really spent the time to analyze some of this particular conduct in great detail. But I think, you know, he's absolutely right, and we agree 100% that, you know, you shouldn't be deciding it without having done that detailed analysis. And that, you know, the most important thing is that, you know, policymakers don't get the idea that they already know the answer without, you know, letting the, you know, the parties on both sides do the hard work of really analyzing what's going on in these particular cases, and to keep antitrust focused on particular practices and not to make broad pronouncements, but to say that, look, this is something that we really have to decide in a case-by-case basis through careful analysis, and some more humility on all sides, you know, to suggest that, you know, we can't possibly have the answers without doing the hard work.
Okay, so let me see if I could just sum up what I'm hearing as the kind of some takeaway message from this, and you guys will tell me if I have that right, and if not, correct me, and if so, that'll be a note to finish on. So I'm hearing there's consensus on these laws have a particular purpose. The purpose is to stop a certain kind of economically harmful activity. And you wanted, or thought to be economically harmful activity, you want to differentiate that from all purpose laws to achieve any outcome that people believe is just. And there's a particular conception of justice behind them that involves, it's not any inequality is unjust, for example. It's as they're being interpreted now, consumers being harmed by monopolistic activities. And you guys are stressing, both Josh and Abraham, the need to have that determination made by a court on facts and going through trying to determine the actual economic facts of the situation, that we shouldn't be, and that's a proper court fact finding, you know, what's the evidence kind of procedure, rather than an all-purpose tool for policy goals. And at least a more abstract level, whether you agree with that in these particular cases or not, I don't know, Herb, you share the idea that it's important that this be limited to economics and finding the facts on economics, even if you were discussing what you think will be the outcomes and the remedies if we get to the remedy phase, whereas Joshua and Abraham were focused on, we don't know if we need remedies yet. Is that a kind of encapsulating where you guys stand on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're dissociating me away from Josh and Abe a little too much. I think the question I was addressing is if there should be a remedy, what kind of remedy would work? It's not clear to me yet that there should be a remedy. We've got a lot of litigation to do before we get to that point. But when we get there, I think it's very important. It's very important that the goal of the remedy be consistent with our underlying goal of antitrust law generally, which is to keep output high, innovation high, as long as it's sustainable, and to benefit consumers that way. And we don't know yet where we are in that course of events.
So with that, do we have consensus then among the three of you on the goal of the law?
Sounds like it.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, I think we do.
And it sounds like on the justice of a law to do that also. That is, there's consensus among the three of you on the panel. Okay, well, thank you. I think this has been really clarifying, both the original discussions and the Q&A with the audience. I hope everybody listening found this this helpful and enlightening, and we will see many of you, I hope, at future events. And thank you to